Imagine being born into a life of luxury, where the world adores you, and yet every step you take is dictated by the invisible chains of wealth. Your every move is calculated, your every breath controlled. This is the gilded cage. But for a handful of brides in America's Gilded Age, these chains were simply too heavy to bear. In a stunning act of rebellion, these young women fled their weddings, leaving behind wealth, status, and the very lives their parents had meticulously planned for them. What did they hope to gain? Freedom, love, or something deeper, darker? Follow their tragic, heart-wrenching journeys as they dared to escape the gilded cage, only to find themselves trapped in a different kind of prison. Chapter 1: The Wedding, a Family's Design. For the daughters of the Gilded Age, weddings were never about love. They were about securing the family's place in the social order. Picture New York City in 1885. The streets gleam with gaslight, and grand hotels rise like cathedrals along Fifth Avenue. Inside the marble foyers, fortunes change hands with a handshake. But for the daughters of railroad tycoons, steel magnates, and banking dynasties, the transaction was far more personal. Their weddings were business mergers, their bodies the signature on the contract. The Gilded Age stretched from the 1870s through the early 1900s. It was an era of unprecedented wealth. Industrialization had minted a new aristocracy. Men like Cornelius Vanderbilt, John D. Rockefeller, and Andrew Carnegie accumulated riches that dwarfed European royalty. By 1890, the top 1% of Americans owned more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. The numbers staggered the imagination. Vanderbilt's fortune exceeded $100 million. In today's currency, that equals more than $2 billion. But wealth created its own problems. And how do you maintain a dynasty? How do you ensure that your fortune survives beyond your death? The answer lay in strategic marriages. Daughters became pawns in an elaborate game of social chess. Marriage in the Gilded Age was not romance, it was calculation. Families spent years planning the perfect union. Mothers kept meticulous lists of eligible bachelors. They tracked bloodlines like horse breeders. A daughter's beauty mattered less than her pedigree. Her intelligence mattered not at all. What mattered was her ability to produce heirs and cement alliances between powerful families. Young women learned their role early. From childhood, they were groomed for a single purpose. They attended finishing schools where they learned French, piano, and the art of polite conversation. They learned how to walk, how to sit, how to smile without showing too much emotion. Spontaneity was dangerous. Independence was unthinkable. The typical heiress lived in a world of suffocating structure. Her day began with a lady's maid dressing her in layers of silk and whalebone. Corsets cinched her waist to 18 inches, making breathing difficult, movement restricted. Breakfast was a formal affair. She could not eat freely. She nibbled at fruit and toast while her mother discussed the social calendar. Every meal, every outing, every conversation was supervised. Privacy did not exist. Chaperones accompanied unmarried women everywhere. A young lady could not walk alone in Central Park. She could not ride in a carriage with a man unless a family member joined them. Even reading material was monitored. Novels that depicted passion or independence were forbidden. The world these women inhabited was smaller than a prison cell. By the time an heiress reached her late teens, the pressure intensified. Mothers hosted elaborate balls designed to showcase their daughters. These events cost tens of thousands of dollars. The ballrooms dripped with crystal chandeliers and imported flowers. Orchestras played Strauss waltzes. Young women glided across marble floors in gowns that cost more than a working family earned in 5 years. But beneath the sparkle lay desperation. The season had a single purpose: to secure a husband, preferably a titled European aristocrat. American money marrying old-world prestige created the perfect alliance. Daughters of industrial titans became countesses and duchesses. Their fathers purchased social legitimacy. The European nobleman gained the fortune to restore his crumbling estate. Everyone won, except the bride. Consider the case of Consuelo Vanderbilt. Her mother, Alva, had grand ambitions. She wanted her daughter to marry a duke, not just any duke, the Duke of Marlborough. Alva orchestrated every detail. She invited the Duke to Newport. She arranged private meetings. She made it clear that Consuelo's fortune would restore Blenheim Palace, the Duke's ancestral home in England. Consuelo was 18 years old. She was in love with someone else, a young American named Winthrop Rutherford. But her mother forbade the relationship. When Consuelo protested, Alva took to her bed, claiming heart troubles. She told her daughter that refusing the Duke would kill her. The guilt crushed Consuelo's resistance. On the wedding day, November 6th, 1895, Consuelo wore a gown that weighed more than 20 pounds. Her veil stretched 18 feet behind her. She walked down the aisle of St. Thomas Church in New York City. 2,000 guests watched. The press called it the wedding of the century. Consuelo later wrote that she cried throughout the ceremony, not tears of joy, tears of despair. She felt like a prisoner being led to execution. This was not unusual. The daughters of the Gilded Age understood their fate. Marriage was duty, not desire. Their feelings were irrelevant. What mattered was the dynasty, the fortune, the family name. But some women could not accept this. The cage felt too small, the chains too heavy. These women began to dream of something impossible. They dreamed of freedom. Chapter 2. Behind the Veil, the Cage of Privilege. Luxury could not mask the suffocating control that wealth held over these young women. The mansions of the Gilded Age were architectural marvels. They rose like palaces along Fifth Avenue, in Newport, in the Berkshires. The Vanderbilt mansion, known as the Breakers, contained 70 rooms. The ballroom alone could hold 200 guests. Marble was imported from Italy, tapestries from France, crystal chandeliers from Austria. The staff numbered more than 30 servants. Maids, butlers, cooks, groundskeepers, coachmen. The cost of maintaining such a home exceeded $100,000 annually. But for the daughters who lived there, these palaces were prisons. Every room was monitored, every action observed. The heiress could not choose her own clothing. She could not decide her daily schedule. She could not even select what she ate for dinner. Control extended to every aspect of her existence. Mothers exercised tyrannical power. They believed they were acting in their daughters' best interests. Ensuring a good marriage meant ensuring financial security for life. But their methods were ruthless. They read their daughter's mail. They vetted every friendship. They forbade relationships with unsuitable men. Suitable meant wealthy, titled, from the right family. Love was not a factor. The media played a cruel role. Newspapers and society magazines tracked these young women like hunters stalking prey. Every appearance, every outfit, every dance partner was documented. Gossip columns speculated about engagements. Cartoonists mocked heiresses who failed to secure husbands. In the press dubbed them dollar princesses, suggesting that their only value lay in their fortunes. One Society columnist wrote in 1892, "Miss So-and-so appeared at the opera last evening, her diamonds glittering like stars, her face as vacant as the moon." One wonders if American heiresses possess any thoughts beyond their jewels. The cruelty was casual, accepted. These women were public property. The pressure created profound psychological damage. Many heiresses developed nervous disorders. They suffered from what doctors called hysteria, though modern medicine would diagnose anxiety and depression. They took laudanum, an opium-based medicine, to calm their nerves. They suffered fainting spells, headaches, insomnia. Some were confined to sanitariums where they underwent rest cures. The cure involved weeks of bed rest, isolation, and force feeding. It often made them worse. Behind closed doors, some fathers were sympathetic. But even loving fathers felt powerless against the social machinery. A father might adore his daughter, might want her happiness. But he also understood the stakes. A bad marriage could destroy the family's reputation. An unmarried daughter became a burden, a failure, a source of shame. The pressure came from every direction. Consider the story of Alice Claypool Vanderbilt. She was the daughter of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, one of the wealthiest men in America. Alice grew up in a world of unimaginable privilege. She had her own suite of rooms, her own staff, her own carriage. But she was profoundly lonely. Her mother was distant, obsessed with social climbing. Her father was consumed by business. Alice spent her days in empty rooms, surrounded by luxury, starved for affection. In her diary, preserved by family historians, Alice wrote, "I am a decoration. I am furniture. I am valued for my name, my dowry, my ability to produce heirs. But I am not seen. No one asks what I think, what I want, what I dream of at night when sleep will not come. I am less free than the scullery maid who scrubs our floors. At least she can quit. I cannot escape this life." The isolation was profound. Heiresses were raised in a world separate from ordinary people. They never attended public schools. They never shopped in markets. They never walked city streets without an escort. Their entire existence unfolded within a narrow circle of wealthy families. They knew perhaps 50 people well. Everyone else was staff or stranger. This isolation made rebellion terrifying. Where would an heiress go if she fled? She possessed no practical skills. She could not cook, clean, or sew. She had never handled money. She did not know how to hire a carriage or purchase a train ticket. The world beyond her mansion was alien territory. Leaving meant stepping into the unknown with no map, no guide, no safety net. Yet the desire for freedom grew. Some women read forbidden books hidden in their rooms. They consumed novels by George Sand and Emily Bronte, stories of women who chose their own paths. They gazed out windows at ordinary people walking freely down the street. They imagined lives where they made their own choices. The catalyst often came in the form of love, not the arranged match their parents designed. Real love, unexpected, inconvenient, impossible love. A young woman might meet a man at a ball, in a not the titled European her mother approved, an American, a lawyer or doctor, or even a struggling artist. Someone who saw her as a person, not a dowry. Someone who made her laugh, who listened when she spoke, who treated her as an equal. These relationships were forbidden. Mothers intervened swiftly. They sent daughters away to Europe on extended tours. They spread rumors about the unsuitable suitor. They threatened disinheritance. The message was clear: conform or be destroyed. But for some women, the threat of disinheritance was not enough. They began to calculate the cost of obedience versus the cost of freedom. Marrying the man their parents chose meant a lifetime of luxury, but it also meant a lifetime of unhappiness. Fleeing meant poverty, scandal, exile from society, but it also meant the possibility of real love, real life. The internal war consumed them. Duty versus desire, security versus freedom. Every day, the wedding date drew closer. The dress was being fitted, the invitations printed, the church reserved, the trap was closing. And then, in a moment of desperate courage, a few women made a choice that shocked the nation. They decided to run. Chapter 3: The Dream of Freedom. In a world of silk and pearls, these women dreamed of something far more elusive: true freedom. Freedom meant different things to different women. For some, it meant choosing their own husband. For others, it meant not marrying at all. For a rare few, it meant pursuing a career, traveling alone, living an independent life. But in the 1880s and 90s, these dreams were radical, dangerous. Women who voiced such desires were labeled unnatural, hysterical, selfish. The seeds of rebellion were planted young. Some heiresses had glimpsed a different world. Perhaps they had a governess who spoke of women's suffrage. Perhaps they had read about women attending universities or working as doctors. These glimpses created questions. Why must I marry a man I do not love? Why can I not choose my own life? The questions had no good answers, at least none that their mothers would accept. The dream of freedom crystallized around specific moments. A young woman might be forced to dance with her future husband at a ball. She would feel his hand on her waist and realize she would have to endure his touch for the rest of her life. The revulsion was physical, or she might overhear her parents discussing her marriage as a business transaction, listing the financial benefits, never mentioning her name except as a commodity. Or she might see a working woman on the street, walking alone, free to go where she pleased, and feel a surge of envy so intense it brought tears. These moments accumulated. The weight became unbearable. Some women confided in sympathetic servants. A lady's maid might become a confidant, the only person who witnessed the tears at night. These servants sometimes became accomplices, helping their mistresses plan escapes. Others confided in siblings, particularly brothers, who had more freedom and could move through the world with ease. Planning an escape required courage and cunning. An heiress could not simply walk out the front door. She was watched constantly. She had no money of her own. Her father controlled the family fortune. Until she married, she was financially dependent. Even her jewelry belonged to her parents. If she fled with nothing, she would be penniless within days. Some women began hoarding small items of value: a gold bracelet, a pair of diamond earrings, things small enough to hide, valuable enough to sell. They squirreled these away in hidden compartments in their rooms. They made secret plans with the men they truly loved. Midnight meetings in gardens, notes passed through sympathetic servants, promises to run away together, to start fresh somewhere far from New York society. The romantic idea sustained them. They imagined a simple life, a small cottage, freedom to wake without a schedule, No balls, no etiquette, no performance. Just two people in love, living honestly. It was a fantasy, of course. They had no concept of what poverty actually meant. They had never cooked a meal or washed their own clothes, but the fantasy provided hope. Other women did not plan elaborate escapes. Their rebellions were more impulsive. The breaking point came suddenly, perhaps on the morning of the wedding, the dress hanging in the room, the church waiting, the guests arriving, and the bride staring at herself in the mirror, seeing a stranger, seeing a woman about to make a terrible mistake. In that moment, panic overrides everything. The instinct to flee becomes overwhelming. One such woman was Julia Marlowe, though her real name was Sarah Frances Frost. She was not born into wealth, but married into it young. Her first husband was a wealthy older man she did not love. On their wedding day in 1884, as she stood in her white dress, she felt a wave of nausea. She realized she could not go through with it. But she did. She walked down the aisle. She spoke her vows, and she regretted it immediately. For 4 years, she lived in misery. Her husband was controlling and cold. He monitored her movements. He refused to let her pursue her passion for acting. She felt herself disappearing. Finally, she found the courage to leave. She filed for divorce, scandalous in that era. She changed her name and became a successful actress, but the price was high. Her family disowned her. Society shunned her. For years, she lived on the edge of poverty. Julia's story illustrated the impossible choice: stay and suffer, or leave and lose everything. There was no good option, only different kinds of pain. By the late 1880s, whispers began circulating in society, stories of brides who disappeared before their weddings, or who fled during the ceremony itself. These stories were suppressed, hidden by families desperate to avoid scandal. But servants talked, rumors spread, the idea took root, escape was possible, difficult, dangerous, but possible. The first widely publicized case came in 1889. Her name was Edith Corse Evans. But Edith was in love with another man, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her, a man who was a year older than her. A man who was a year older than her. A man who was a year older than her. A man who was a year older than her. A man who was a year older than her. A man who was a year older than her. A man who was a year older than her. A man who was a year older than her. A man who was a year older than her. A man who was a year older than her. A man who was a year older than her. A man who was a year older than her. A man who was a year older than her. A man who was a year older than her. A man who was a year older than her. A man who was a year older than her. A man who was a year older than her. A man who was a year older than her. A. But Edith was in love with another man, a writer named Robert. He had no fortune. He had no prospects. But he saw her as a person. He made her laugh. He treated her with respect. In the weeks before the wedding, Edith grew increasingly desperate. She begged her parents to cancel the engagement. They refused. They reminded her of her duty to the family. They told her that love was a childish fantasy, that marriage was about security and status, that she would learn to be content with her wealthy husband. Edith knew they were wrong. She knew that marrying this man would destroy her. And so, 3 days before the wedding, she made her choice. She packed a small bag. She took a few pieces of jewelry. And in the middle of the night, she climbed out her bedroom window and ran. She met Robert at a train station. Together, they fled to California. They lived in obscurity. They were poor, but they were free. Or so the story went. The truth, as always, was more complicated. But the idea captivated the public imagination. A wealthy heiress choosing love over luxury. It was the ultimate romantic rebellion. What no one discussed was the terror Edith must have felt that night. Climbing out the window, walking through dark streets, boarding a train with a man she barely knew, gambling her entire future on the hope that he truly loved her. The courage it took, the desperation, the absolute conviction that anything was better than marrying the man her parents chose. As the 1890s began, more stories emerged. More women found the courage to flee. The gilded cage was cracking. The chains were weakening. The age of obedience was ending. The age of rebellion had begun. Chapter 4. The Great Escape begins. On the morning of their wedding day, a few brides chose not to walk down the aisle, but to run into the unknown. The first escape that truly captured national attention involved a woman named Catherine "Kitty" Van Rensselaer. She was the daughter of a New York banking family worth an estimated $10 million. In 1893, when Kitty was 21 years old, her parents arranged her marriage to Count Luigi Salviati, an Italian nobleman. The Count was 43. He needed money to maintain his estates in Tuscany. Kitty's father needed the social prestige of a titled son-in-law. It was a perfect transaction. Except Kitty hated the Count. She found him pompous, arrogant, and cruel. During their brief courtship, he treated her as property he had already purchased. He corrected her manners. He criticized her appearance. He made clear that once they married, she would obey him absolutely. Kitty felt like livestock being inspected at market, but she was in love with someone else. His name was Thomas Walsh, the son of her father's business partner. Thomas was American and young, kind, and utterly unsuitable. His family had money, but not nearly enough to satisfy the Van Rensselaers. More importantly, Thomas lacked a title. Marrying him would bring no social advancement. Kitty's mother forbade the relationship. She sent Kitty to Europe for 6 months, hoping distance would cool the romance. It did not. The wedding was planned for October 28th, 1893. The ceremony would take place at Grace Church in Manhattan. 800 guests were invited. The bride's dress cost $5,000. The flowers alone cost $3,000. Every detail was arranged. Everything was perfect. Except the bride had no intention of attending. 2 days before the wedding, Kitty confided her plan to her lady's maid, Ellen. She would flee the morning of the ceremony. Thomas would meet her with a carriage 2 blocks from the house. They would take a train to Philadelphia, then continue west. They would marry in Chicago, far from her family's reach. Ellen tried to dissuade her. She warned Kitty of the consequences: disinheritance, scandal, a life of poverty. But Kitty's mind was made. She would rather be poor and happy than wealthy and miserable. On the morning of October 28th, the von Rensselaer mansion erupted into chaos. Servants scurried through halls. Florists arranged centerpieces. The bride's mother supervised every detail with military precision. Upstairs, Kitty's hair was being arranged. Her gown was being pressed. Everything proceeded according to schedule, until Kitty asked for a moment alone. She claimed she needed to pray before the ceremony. Her mother, satisfied that her daughter was appropriately solemn, granted the request. She left Kitty in her bedroom, door closed. Ellen stood guard outside. What happened next became the stuff of legend. Kitty did not pray. She changed out of her dressing gown into a simple traveling suit Ellen had hidden in the wardrobe. She grabbed a small bag containing jewelry and a few personal items. Then she climbed out her second-story window onto a narrow ledge. The drop to the ground was 15 feet. Too far to jump safely, but a trellis covered in ivy ran down the side of the house. Kitty had climbed it as a child. She knew it would hold her weight. She hiked up her skirts and began her descent. Her hands shook. Her heart pounded. If anyone saw her, the escape would fail. But luck held. The servants were busy inside. The street was empty. She reached the ground undetected. Kitty ran. She ran down Fifth Avenue in broad daylight, a young woman in a traveling suit, clutching a bag, running as if her life depended on it. Because it did. 2 blocks away, Thomas waited with a hired carriage. When he saw her, his face transformed with relief and joy. They embraced. Then they climbed into the carriage and disappeared into the city. Back at the mansion, the discovery of Kitty's absence came 30 minutes before the ceremony. Her mother went to fetch her for the ride to the church. She knocked on the bedroom door. No answer. She knocked again. Still nothing. She opened the door. The room was empty. The window was open. The wedding dress hung unused. The screaming could be heard throughout the house. Kitty's mother collapsed. Servants rushed to revive her. Kitty's father stormed through the house, demanding answers. How had she escaped? Who helped her? Where had she gone? No one knew, or if they knew, they refused to say. Ellen claimed ignorance. The other servants were genuinely baffled. At Grace Church, 800 guests waited. The orchestra played. The flowers perfumed the air. The groom, Count Salviati, stood at the altar, growing increasingly impatient. An hour passed, then 2. Finally, a messenger arrived. He whispered to the Count. The Count's face turned purple with rage. He stormed out of the church without a word. The guests erupted into confused chatter. What had happened? Where was the bride? By evening, the story was everywhere. Newspapers printed special editions. "Heiress flees wedding," the headlines screamed. "Runaway bride escapes gilded cage." The public was fascinated. Some praised Kitty's courage. Others condemned her selfishness. Society matrons were horrified. How dare she humiliate her family? The Van Rensselaers would never recover from the scandal. The Van Rensselaer family immediately began damage control. They claimed Kitty had suffered a nervous breakdown. They spread rumors that she was mentally unstable, that the wedding had been postponed for her health. But the truth leaked out. Servants talked, friends whispered. Within days, everyone knew. Kitty had run away to marry Thomas Walsh. She had chosen love over duty. She had escaped the gilded cage. The Count returned to Italy, humiliated and empty-handed. He later sued the Van Rensselaers for breach of contract, demanding compensation for the broken engagement. The case was settled out of court for an undisclosed sum. Kitty's father, furious at the embarrassment and financial loss, disowned his daughter. He removed her from his will. He forbade anyone in the family from contacting her. As far as he was concerned, Kitty Van Rensselaer no longer existed, but Kitty and Thomas were married. They started a life together in Chicago, far from New York's judgmental eyes. For a brief moment, it seemed like a fairy tale ending. The rebellious heiress had won. She had claimed her freedom. She had chosen love. What happened next would prove that escape was only the beginning. The real test was surviving the aftermath. Chapter 5. Scandals Unleashed. What happened after a society darling fled her gilded cage? The media erupted, and the public was both horrified and captivated. The press treated runaway brides as a national obsession. Newspapers competed to uncover details. Where had the bride gone? Who helped her escape? What would her family do? Every development was front-page news. Reporters camped outside family mansions. They interviewed servants, bribed coachmen, tracked down anyone with information. Privacy ceased to exist. The tone of the coverage revealed deep societal divisions. Conservative papers condemned the brides as selfish, ungrateful, and morally corrupt. They argued that women who abandoned their families deserved no sympathy. One editorial in the New York Herald declared, "These foolish girls, seduced by romantic notions, throw away fortunes and families for penniless suitors. They will learn too late that poverty is no adventure. It is a slow, grinding misery." But other papers took a different view. Progressive publications praised the bride's courage. They framed the escapes as heroic acts of self-determination. And women's rights advocates seized on the stories as evidence that marriage laws needed reform. They argued that forcing women into unwanted marriages was a form of slavery. One suffragist wrote, "When a woman must flee her own wedding to claim her freedom, the institution of marriage has become a prison." The public was divided. Working-class women often sympathized with the runaway brides. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, the suffocating nature of obligation. And many working women were also trapped in unhappy marriages or forced into unwanted situations by economic necessity. They saw the heiresses as sisters in struggle, even if the details differed. One factory worker told a reporter, "Rich or poor, a woman's got no say in her own life. At least these girls are trying to change that." But wealthy society condemned the rebellions without mercy. The escapes threatened the entire social order. If daughters could defy their parents, if they could reject carefully planned marriages, the system would collapse. Old money families closed ranks. They spread vicious rumors about the runaway brides. They claimed the women were mentally unbalanced, morally degenerate, or corrupted by low-class influences. They worked to ensure that any woman who fled would never be welcomed back into polite society. The scandal surrounding Kitty Van Rensselaer intensified in the weeks following her escape. The Van Rensselaer family hired private investigators to track her down, not to bring her home, but to gather evidence for potential legal action. They considered having her declared mentally incompetent. If they succeeded, they could force her into an asylum and seize control of any inheritance she might claim. The investigators found Kitty and Thomas living in a modest apartment in Chicago. They were struggling financially. Thomas worked as a clerk. Kitty tried to adjust to middle-class life. She learned to cook badly. She washed clothes. She shopped for groceries. Everything was unfamiliar and difficult. But she insisted she was happy. She told the investigators reported back. The Van investigators reported back. The Van Rensselaers were not satisfied. They wanted Kitty to suffer publicly. They leaked stories to the press about her dire circumstances. They claimed she was living in squalor, that Thomas was abusive, that she regretted her decision. None of it was true. But the stories damaged her reputation further. She became a cautionary tale. See what happens when you defy your parents? You end up in poverty and shame. Other families watched the Van Rensselaer scandal with growing alarm. If one daughter could flee successfully, others might follow. The fear spread through society like contagion. Mothers became more vigilant. They monitored their daughters more closely. They vetted suitors more carefully. They accelerated wedding plans to prevent cold feet. The pressure intensified. But so did the rebellions. In 1894, another heiress fled. Her name was Grace Wilson, daughter of a railroad magnate. She was engaged to a British earl. On the eve of her wedding, she eloped with a young American lawyer. The story followed the same pattern: outraged family, sensational headlines, public fascination, and Grace was disowned. The earl sued for breach of promise. Society buzzed with gossip. Then came Emily Astor, related to the famous Astor dynasty. She fled in 1895, just hours before her ceremony. She left a note explaining that she could not marry a man she did not love. Her family claimed the note was forged. They insisted she had been kidnapped. They offered a reward for her return. But Emily was not kidnapped. She had chosen to disappear. She eventually surfaced in San Francisco, married to a music teacher with no fortune or family connections. The pattern was clear. The daughters of America's wealthiest families were in revolt. They were rejecting the carefully constructed alliances their parents had planned. They were choosing autonomy over obedience. The media dubbed it the Great Heiress Rebellion. Some celebrated it. Others mourned it as the death of civilized society. The scandal reached such heights that it became a topic of sermons. Ministers preached about the dangers of romantic love. They warned young women against the sin of disobedience. They reminded their congregations that marriage was a sacred duty, not a personal choice. One prominent minister declared, "These rebellious daughters are symptoms of a deeper moral decay. When women abandon duty for desire, civilization itself is threatened." But the rebellions continued. By 1896, at least a dozen high-profile cases had made headlines. Each followed a similar arc: desperate bride, daring escape, family outrage, public scandal, and always the question, did she make the right choice? The media loved to track down the runaway brides years later, and report on their circumstances. The stories were rarely uplifting. Most of the women were living in reduced circumstances. They had lost their fortunes. They were estranged from their families. Some were divorced. Others were widowed and struggling to survive. The press presented these outcomes as vindication. See, defying your parents leads to ruin. But if you read between the lines, a different story emerged. Many of the women, despite their hardships, insisted they did not regret their choices. They spoke of the value of living authentically, of making their own decisions, of experiencing real love, even if it did not last. They had traded material comfort for spiritual freedom, and for some, that trade was worth it, yet the price was steep. The scandal followed them everywhere. They could not escape their past. Employers hesitated to hire women with such notorious reputations. Landlords refused to rent to them. Shopkeepers gossiped when they entered stores. The scarlet letter of defiance marked them permanently. The families who disowned these women never forgave. Even decades later, when parents lay dying, many refused to reconcile with their runaway daughters. Wills specifically excluded them. Inheritance went to siblings or charities. The message was clear. Defiance will not be tolerated. Not ever. Not for any reason. The ultimate irony was that the scandals achieved the opposite of their intended effect. Instead of deterring future rebellions, they inspired them. Young women read the stories and saw themselves. They recognized the gilded cage. They understood the desperation. And some decided that if escape was possible, they would attempt it too. The price might be high, but the alternative, a lifetime of enforced unhappiness, was higher still. Chapter 6. The Price of Escape. What freedom comes without a price? For some of these women, the cost was their very place in society. Disinheritance was the first and most immediate consequence. When a wealthy father removed his daughter from his will, he did not simply cut off her allowance. He erased her from the family legacy. He declared that she no longer existed as his child. The psychological impact was devastating. Many runaway brides had been close to their fathers. They had believed, despite everything, that their parents loved them. Disinheritance proved otherwise. Love in these families was conditional. It depended on obedience. The financial impact was catastrophic. An heiress raised in luxury had no concept of budgeting. She had never worried about rent or food costs. She had never calculated the price of coal for heating or the cost of shoes. When suddenly faced with limited funds, she was helpless. Many runaway brides discovered that the jewelry they smuggled out was worth far less than they imagined. A diamond bracelet might fetch a few $100s. That seemed like a fortune. But it disappeared quickly when you had to pay for everything yourself. Consider Kitty Van Rensselaer's experience. She and Thomas Walsh started their married life in Chicago with approximately $2,000, the proceeds from selling her jewelry. They rented a small apartment for $30 per month. Food cost another $40 monthly. Coal, clothing, transportation, and other necessities added up. Within 3 months, half their money was gone. Thomas earned $60 per month as a clerk. It was a decent middle-class wage. But for Kitty, who had grown up in a world where her mother's ball gown cost more than Thomas earned in a year, it was shocking poverty. She had to learn skills she had never needed. Cooking was a foreign language. She burned everything. She had no sense of how much food to buy or how to store it properly. Half of what she purchased spoiled before she could use it. Laundry was equally baffling. She ruined several of Thomas's shirts by washing them with hot water and harsh soap. She had never understood that servants possessed actual skills. She had assumed housework was simple, that anyone could do it. She was wrong. The psychological adjustment was even harder. Kitty had been raised to believe she was special, superior, deserving of deference and luxury. Suddenly, she was nobody. Shopgirls ignored her. Landlords treated her with indifference. No one cared that she was a Van Rensselaer. Here, that name meant nothing. She was just another struggling young woman trying to make ends meet. The loss of status wounded her more than the loss of money. Other runaway brides faced worse. Emily Astor, who fled to San Francisco, discovered that her husband, the music teacher, was already married. He had lied to her. He had married her for her potential inheritance, assuming her family would eventually relent and restore her fortune. When it became clear they would not, he abandoned her. Emily was left alone in a strange city with no money and no prospects. She took work as a seamstress. She lived in a boarding house that cost $12 per month. At night, she sewed piecework for clothing manufacturers, earning pennies per garment, and grieved the loss of their families. They grieved the loss of their families. They missed their mothers despite everything. They missed their siblings. They missed the comfort and security of their old lives. Yes, they had been trapped, but the cage had been comfortable. Now they were free but miserable. Was this really better? Some women attempted reconciliation. They wrote letters to their parents, begging for forgiveness. Most letters went unanswered. A few received cold, formal replies stating that the door was permanently closed. The fathers who had once doted on their daughters now refused to acknowledge their existence. The mothers who had supervised every detail of their lives now pretended they had never been born. Legal battles added to the suffering. Several jilted grooms sued for breach of promise. In the 1890s, a broken engagement was considered a legal contract violation. If a woman called off a wedding, the groom could sue for damages. He claimed financial losses, emotional distress, and damage to his reputation. Some of these lawsuits succeeded. Courts ordered the bride's family to pay compensation. The families, in turn, blamed their runaway daughters. They sent threatening letters. They demanded the women return home to face the consequences. The women refused. They had chosen exile over submission. The social exile was perhaps the most painful price. Runaway brides were not simply excluded from society. They were erased. Their names were removed from social registers. Their former friends crossed the street to avoid them. Invitations stopped. If they tried to attend church or theater, they were asked to leave. They were pariahs, untouchable. The few families who did not disown their runaway daughters still imposed restrictions. They might allow limited contact, but forbade the daughter from attending family gatherings. She could not visit during holidays. She could not meet her nieces and nephews. She was a shameful secret, hidden away, never mentioned. This partial acceptance was sometimes worse than complete rejection. It kept hope alive while delivering constant reminders of what had been lost. Some runaway brides turned to each other for support. They formed a small, informal network. They corresponded by letter. They offered advice and sympathy. They understood each other's struggles in ways no one else could. These friendships provided a lifeline, but they also reinforced their outsider status. They were the fallen women, the rebels, the disgraced daughters. They would never belong anywhere else. And then there were the children. Several runaway brides had babies within the first years of their new lives. These children grew up in poverty, knowing nothing of the wealth their mothers had abandoned. Some mothers never told their children about their origins. They kept the secret, fearing their children would resent them for throwing away a fortune. Other mothers told their children everything, turning their escape stories into moral lessons. The children received the stories differently. Some admired their mother's courage. Others felt cheated. Why had their mothers condemned them to poverty when they could have lived in luxury? The passage of time did not ease the consequences. As the runaway brides aged, their situations often worsened. Their husbands died or left. Without family support or inherited wealth, they faced destitution. Some ended up in poorhouses, institutions for the destitute elderly. These were grim places, crowded and unsanitary. Women who had once slept on silk sheets now shared beds with strangers. Women who had once dined on French cuisine now ate thin gruel. The fall from grace was complete. Yet even facing these dire circumstances, many refused to express regret. When journalists tracked them down, expecting to hear confessions of foolish mistakes, they instead heard defiance. "I would do it again," Grace Wilson told a reporter in 1910 when she was 40 years old, widowed, and working as a boarding house keeper. "I lived my life on my own terms. That is worth more than all the millions I might have inherited." Was it? That was the question no one could definitively answer. The price of escape was measurable. Lost fortunes, broken families, social exile, poverty, suffering. But the value of freedom was harder to quantify. How do you measure the worth of making your own choices, of loving whom you choose, of living authentically rather than performing a role? The runaway brides had made their calculation. They had decided that freedom, however costly, was worth pursuing. But as their lives unfolded, as the hardships accumulated, some began to wonder. Had they traded one prison for another? But at least in the gilded cage, they had eaten well. Chapter 7. A New Life or New Prison. After fleeing their gilded weddings, some found new love, while others found themselves trapped in different kinds of prisons. The dream of freedom rarely matched reality. The runaway brides had imagined lives of romantic simplicity, small cottages with rose gardens, loving husbands who treated them as equals, days filled with genuine happiness rather than performative elegance. But life is not a fairy tale. And poverty, it turned out, was its own kind of cage. For Kitty Van Rensselaer Walsh, the first year of marriage was an education in disappointment. Thomas, her great love, proved to be a kind man, but a weak one. He struggled in his career. He had little ambition. He had seemed different from the wealthy men Kitty knew because he was gentle and attentive. But those qualities did not translate into success in the working world. He was passed over for promotions. He earned barely enough to support them. Kitty began to understand that her parents had not been entirely wrong. Love did not pay the rent. Thomas also resented Kitty's background. He had grown up comfortably middle class, but not wealthy. He had worked for everything he had. Kitty had been born into limitless wealth. She had never worried about money until now. Thomas felt inadequate. He knew she had given up a fortune for him. The weight of that sacrifice crushed him. He became moody, withdrawn. He drank more. Their arguments grew frequent. Kitty realized with growing horror that she had married a man she barely knew. Courtship under the watchful eyes of chaperones had taught her nothing about who Thomas really was. Now she was trapped with him. Legally, a wife belonged to her husband. She could not leave without becoming an even greater scandal. By their third anniversary, Kitty was pregnant with their second child. They lived in a cramped apartment. Thomas's drinking had worsened. He lost his job. They relied on Kitty selling her last pieces of jewelry to survive. She looked at her children, at their shabby clothes and thin faces, and felt a guilt so profound it made her physically sick. These children could have grown up as Van Rensselaers. They could have had every advantage. Instead, they had nothing. Because of her. Because she had been selfish enough to choose love. But if she had married the Count, she would have been wealthy, yes, but she would have been miserable. She would have been trapped in a loveless marriage. Her children would have been strangers, raised by nurses and governesses. Was that better? She did not know anymore. The certainties that had driven her escape had dissolved into ambiguity. Other runaway brides found different prisons. Grace Wilson, who had married a young lawyer, discovered that her husband was abusive. Behind closed doors, away from society's gaze, he revealed his true nature. He was controlling and violent. When Grace expressed unhappiness, he reminded her that she had nowhere to go. Her family had disowned her. She had no money. She was completely dependent on him. He could do whatever he wanted, and he did. Grace endured years of physical and emotional abuse. She stayed because she had no choice. This was the freedom she had chosen. Emily Astor, abandoned by her bigamist husband, never recovered. She worked herself to exhaustion in San Francisco's garment district. She developed a chronic cough from the poor ventilation in the factories. By her early 30s, she was frail and sick. She wrote one final letter to her mother, begging for help. The letter was returned, unopened. Emily died in 1903, age 35, in a charity ward. She had no money for a proper burial. Her grave was unmarked. The Astor fortune, which numbered in the tens of millions of dollars, could have saved her. But she had been erased from the family. Her death went unnoticed by everyone except the handful of fellow seamstresses who had known her. Not every story ended in tragedy. A few runaway brides found genuine happiness. Margaret Lawrence, who fled her wedding in 1897, married a country doctor. They moved to rural Vermont. Margaret adjusted to simple living. She gardened. She helped her husband with his medical practice. She raised 3 children. She never regretted her choice. In letters to friends, she described her life as peaceful. She had no servants, no ball gowns, no social obligations, but she had something more valuable: autonomy. Her days were her own. Her choices were her own. She was poor by her family's standards, but by her own measurement, she was rich. Margaret's success was the exception. Most runaway brides struggled. They struggled financially, emotionally, socially. They were pioneers in uncharted territory. No guidebook existed for wealthy women who chose poverty over privilege. They had to invent their own paths. Some succeeded, most did not. The fundamental problem was structural. A woman in the late 1800s had extremely limited options. She could not vote. She could not own property in her own name if she was married. She could not enter most professions. She had no legal rights to her own children. If her husband chose to be cruel, she had little recourse. Divorce was scandalous and difficult to obtain. Running away from one man often meant running directly into the arms of another. Either way, she remained trapped by the limitations of her gender. The runaway brides had believed that their oppression stemmed from wealth. They thought that escaping the gilded cage would free them, but they discovered that the cage was larger than they realized. It encompassed all of society. Wealth had provided certain cushions. It had protected them from the harshest realities of womanhood. Without wealth, those realities became inescapable. Consider the simple matter of clothing. An heiress wore elaborate gowns that required assistance to put on and take off. These gowns were impractical, but they signaled status. When Kitty Van Rensselaer became Kitty Walsh, she had to learn to dress herself in simpler garments. But those simpler garments were still long skirts and restrictive undergarments. She still could not move freely. She still could not run or climb. The clothing itself was a prison that transcended class. Or consider the matter of education. Heiresses attended finishing schools where they learned accomplishments designed to attract husbands. They did not learn mathematics, science, or practical skills. When they fled their families, they had no marketable abilities. They could play piano, they could speak French, they could arrange flowers beautifully. None of this helped them earn a living. They were trapped by their own useless education. The runaway brides began to see the limitations clearly. They had escaped one specific cage, but remained trapped in a larger one. True freedom would require changing society itself. A few became activists. They joined the women's suffrage movement. They spoke at rallies about their experiences. They argued that women needed legal rights, economic opportunities, and educational access. Without these things, running away from a bad marriage was merely jumping from one prison to another. But most runaway brides did not become activists. They were too busy surviving. They worked exhausting jobs. They raised children. They tried to make the best of difficult situations. They did not have energy left for revolution. They had made their personal rebellions. That had to be enough. As the years passed, some women attempted to rebuild relationships with their families. They wrote letters. They sent photographs of grandchildren. They hoped that time had softened the anger. A few families relented. They allowed carefully supervised visits. They provided small financial gifts. But most families remained implacable. The doors stayed closed. The inheritance stayed with the obedient siblings. The runaway brides remained exiled. The question haunted them: had it been worth it? They had gained the freedom to choose their own husbands. But many discovered that those husbands were disappointing, abusive, or absent. They had gained the freedom to live without parental supervision. But that freedom came with poverty, isolation, and grinding hard work. They had gained the satisfaction of defying unjust expectations. But that satisfaction provided little comfort when they could not feed their children. The honest answer was that it depended. For women like Margaret Lawrence, who found happy marriages and peaceful lives, the trade was worthwhile. For women like Emily Astor, who died alone and destitute, the trade was catastrophic. For women like Kitty Walsh, who struggled but survived, the answer remained ambiguous. Every day brought a new calculation. Every hardship raised the question anew. Every moment of genuine connection with her husband reminded her why she had fled. Every hungry cry from her children made her wonder if she had been unforgivably selfish. What was clear was that escape alone was not enough. The gilded cage was real, but so were all the other cages that constrained women's lives. Destroying one cage did not grant true freedom. It merely revealed all the others. Chapter 8. The Silent Return. Not all the brides who fled were free. They returned, often quietly, and with a new kind of regret. The return was always shameful. It meant admitting defeat. It meant acknowledging that the parents had been right all along. It meant crawling back to the very people who had tried to force an unwanted marriage. For a woman who had fled, who had declared her independence, who had endured scandal and exile, returning home required swallowing an impossible amount of pride. Yet some did return. The reasons varied. Some returned because their marriages had failed spectacularly. Their husbands had abandoned them or died. They had no money and nowhere else to go. Starvation is a powerful motivator. Other women returned because they simply could not endure poverty any longer. The constant struggle wore them down. They missed comfort. They missed security. They missed being warm in winter and full after meals. Love did not keep you alive. Money did. The terms of return were always humiliating. Families did not simply welcome back their prodigal daughters. They imposed conditions. The returning bride had to publicly admit her mistake. She had to apologize. Forgiveness. Essentially, she returned as forgiveness. Essentially, she returned as a prisoner, but now with the added weight of proven untrustworthiness. Anna Gould was a notable example, though her story differed slightly from the runaway bride pattern. Anna was the daughter of Jay Gould, one of the wealthiest railroad barons in America. In 1895, she married Count Boniface de Castellane, a French nobleman. Her father approved the marriage. It was not a case of parental force, but it was a strategic alliance. The Count needed money. Anna needed a title. It seemed perfect. It was not. The Count was a spendthrift and a philanderer. He spent Anna's money with reckless abandon. In 12 years of marriage, he went through an estimated $15 million of her fortune. He built extravagant palaces. He hosted lavish parties. He kept multiple mistresses. Anna was miserable. She was also trapped. Divorce was scandalous. Her family urged her to endure. After all, she was a countess. What more did she want? Finally, in 1906, Anna found the courage to leave. She filed for divorce in France, where she had been living. The case was sensational. The French courts granted the divorce, awarding Anna custody of their children. She returned to New York, humiliated but free. Her family took her back, though not without reservations. She had embarrassed them. She had proven that even strategic marriages could fail. Anna's return was relatively comfortable because she had money. Her father had left her a fortune in trust that the Count could not touch. She was financially independent. Most runaway brides who returned had no such cushion. They came back broke, desperate, and powerless. Consider the case of a woman known in historical records only as Mrs. H. For her, money. When he learned she had, for her, money. When he learned she had been disinherited, he abandoned her within 6 months. Mrs. H found herself alone in a strange city with no resources. She tried to find work, but she had no skills and no references. No one would hire a woman with her scandalous reputation. She was forced to sell the clothes off her back for food money. After 3 months of desperate poverty, she returned to her parents' home. Her father made her kneel in the drawing room and beg forgiveness in front of the family. Her mother wept and said she had aged 10 years from the shame. Her siblings looked at her with contempt. She was given a small room in the servants' quarters, not her old bedroom. She ate meals with the staff. She was not allowed to attend social events. For all intents and purposes, she was a prisoner in her own family home. But at least she was warm. At least she ate regularly. She accepted these terms because the alternative was starvation. The psychological impact of returning was devastating. A woman who had once declared her independence, who had tasted freedom, however briefly, now found herself more controlled than ever. Her parents trusted her less than they had before. They watched her constantly. They controlled her every movement. Any request for autonomy was denied. She had proven herself incapable of making good decisions. Therefore, she would make no decisions at all. Some returning brides became shells of their former selves. They stopped speaking unless spoken to. They stopped expressing opinions. They became obedient automatons, doing exactly as they were told. This was what their parents wanted: a docile daughter, a lesson to others. See what happens when you rebel? You lose everything. You become nothing. Yet you return in disgrace and live out your days in servitude. Other families were slightly more forgiving. They allowed their returning daughters a measure of dignity. The daughters lived in the family home but were not actively punished. They were simply excluded from society. They did not attend balls or dinners. They did not marry. They became permanent spinsters, living on the edges of their families' lives. They were tolerated but not embraced. The message was clear. You made your choice. These are the consequences. A few families attempted to arrange new marriages for their returning daughters. This was difficult. The scandal of a broken engagement or a failed elopement damaged a woman's reputation permanently. Prospective husbands were rare. The men who did express interest were often deeply flawed themselves. They were much older, or previously married, or of questionable character. They were willing to overlook the scandal because they were desperate for any wife. The returning brides were in no position to refuse. They married these men and resigned themselves to unhappy unions. The cruelest irony was that many women who returned would have been better off if they had simply submitted to their parents' original choice of husband. At least then, they would have maintained their social standing. They would have lived in comfort. They would have avoided years of poverty and suffering. Their rebellion had achieved nothing except pain. This realization was soul-crushing. Some historians argue that the returning bride's stories are the saddest of all. They took the enormous risk of fleeing. They endured scandal and hardship, and in the end, they lost anyway. They ended up back where they started, but with less dignity, less hope, and less autonomy. Their brief taste of freedom made their renewed captivity even more bitter. Yet there is another interpretation. Perhaps the act of fleeing, even if it ultimately failed, i.e. had value, perhaps the attempt itself mattered. These women tried to claim their own lives. They tried to resist the forces that sought to control them. They failed, yes, but they tried. In an era when most women never dared to resist at all, the attempt was significant. The returning brides themselves rarely spoke about their experiences. They were too ashamed. They had been broken by their failures. They lived out their lives quietly, trying not to draw attention, in trying not to remember the brief moment when they thought they could be free. Their stories were forgotten, or rather, they were remembered only as cautionary tales. Don't be like her. Don't throw away your advantages for a foolish dream. Stay in your place. Accept your fate. This is the price of rebellion. The price was indeed high. But what these cautionary tales never acknowledged was the cost of obedience. The women who stayed, who married men they did not love, who spent their lives performing roles they did not choose, paid their own price. That price was simply more socially acceptable. It was hidden behind wealth and status. But it was real. The question was not whether there would be a price. There was always a price. The question was which price you were willing to pay. Chapter 9. Reputations destroyed. When a woman's reputation is torn apart, what remains? For these heiresses, their fall from grace was not swift. It was excruciatingly slow. Reputation in the Gilded Age was currency. For women especially, reputation determined everything. A woman with a spotless reputation could marry well, move through society freely, and enjoy a certain measure of respect. A woman with a damaged reputation became invisible, or worse, a target of cruelty. The runaway brides discovered that while they could escape their families, they could not escape the court of public opinion. The process of reputation destruction began immediately. The moment a bride fled, newspapers began crafting the narrative. They did not wait for facts. They speculated wildly. Was she mentally unbalanced? Had she been seduced by a fortune hunter? Had she been secretly meeting a lover for months? The stories multiplied. Each retelling added new salacious details. By the time the truth emerged, if it ever did, the false narrative had become accepted reality. Society matrons were merciless. They gathered at afternoon teas and dissected every detail of the scandal. They claimed to be horrified, but their fascination was obvious. They relished the fall of these young women, perhaps because it confirmed their own choices. They had married for duty, not love. They had sacrificed their desires for family expectations. Seeing a young woman choose differently and suffer for it validated their own compromises. The language used to describe runaway brides was deliberately dehumanizing. They were called foolish girls, ungrateful daughters, fallen women. The press questioned their morals, their sanity, their basic decency. One editorial stated, "A woman who would abandon her family on her wedding day possesses neither honor nor shame. She is a creature of base instincts, unworthy of the station into which she was born." The destruction was not limited to public forums. Private social networks ensured that the runaway brides were permanently excluded. Ace would quietly ask her to leave. If she would quietly ask her to leave. If she walked down Fifth Avenue, former friends would cross the street to avoid greeting her. The message was unmistakable. You are not welcome here. You will never be welcome here again. Former friends were often the cruelest. As young women who had been intimate companions suddenly refused to acknowledge the runaway bride's existence. They feared contamination. Association with a scandal could damage their own reputations. Better to cut ties completely. Letters went unanswered. Visits were refused. Decades-long friendships evaporated overnight. The runaway bride discovered that her social world had been built on sand. The moment she stepped outside prescribed boundaries, everything collapsed. Family members participated in the destruction. Siblings were often pressured to denounce their runaway sisters. At family gatherings, the runaway bride's name became taboo. If someone mentioned her, they were quickly silenced. It was as if she had died, except death would have been more honorable. At least a dead daughter received sympathy. A runaway bride received only scorn. The legal system added its weight to the destruction. Breach of promise lawsuits ruined families financially, but they also served another purpose: public humiliation. Court proceedings were reported in newspapers. Intimate details of courtships and private conversations became public knowledge. The bride's character was attacked by lawyers who portrayed her as a seductress or a lunatic. Even when the bride won the case, she lost. Her reputation was so thoroughly shredded that victory meant nothing. Financial destruction often accompanied reputational ruin. Disinheritance was standard. But some families went further. They called in loans they had extended to their daughters' husbands. They sabotaged business opportunities. If the runaway bride's husband tried to establish a career, the family used their influence to block him. Employers received discreet warnings. Business partners withdrew. The couple found themselves systematically excluded from any path to financial stability. The family wanted to ensure that the runaway bride's choice led to maximum suffering. The children of runaway brides inherited their mother's damaged reputations. They were marked from birth. If they tried to enter society when they came of age, they were rejected. The sins of the mother visited upon the children. Some of these children changed their names, trying to escape their family history. Others spent their lives bitter, resenting their mothers for the opportunities they had lost. The destruction spanned generations. The slow erosion of identity was perhaps the most insidious aspect. A woman's sense of self in the Gilded Age was largely externally defined. She was her family's daughter. She was her husband's wife. She was a member of her social class. When all these external markers were stripped away, what remained? Many runaway brides discovered they did not know. They had been raised to perform roles, not to develop inner resources. Without status, without acceptance, without structure, that time and positive actions would restore their standing. It rarely worked. Society had long memories. A scandal from decades past could still be weaponized against a woman trying to re-enter polite company. The stain was permanent. Others gave up entirely. They retreated into obscurity. They moved to distant cities where no one knew their history. They took on new identities. They told their children nothing about their past. This solution worked better, but it required severing all connections to their former lives. They lived as ghosts, haunting the margins of society, neither fully present nor fully erased. A few runaway brides embraced their outcast status. If society insisted on treating them as scandalous, they would be scandalous. They lived unconventionally. They spoke freely. They refused to apologize. This defiance was admirable, but costly. These women lived in poverty and isolation. They were brave, but they were also lonely. Defiance could not substitute for community. The press occasionally ran "Where Are They Now" features on famous runaway brides. These articles were presented as cautionary tales. They detailed the former heiresses' reduced circumstances. They quoted neighbors describing the women as worn down and sad. They contrasted the current poverty with former wealth. The subtext was always the same. This is what happens when you defy your parents. This is what rebellion costs. But the articles never examined the alternative. They never profiled the women who had obeyed, who had married the men their parents chose. How many of those women were happy? How many lived in quiet desperation, trapped in loveless marriages, wishing they had been brave enough to run? Those stories were not told. Obedient misery was socially acceptable. It did not make headlines. Only rebellion was newsworthy. By the early 1900s, the phenomenon of runaway brides had mostly ended. Society had tightened its control. The cautionary tales had their intended effect. Young women learned the lesson: do not rebel. The price is too high. Conform, obey, survive. The gilded cage had won. But the women who had fled, who had dared to claim their own lives, left a legacy. They proved that escape was possible. They demonstrated that women were not passive objects to be traded between families. They showed that even in the face of overwhelming social pressure, individual will could prevail. Their reputations were destroyed, but they had lived, however briefly, on their own terms. For some, that was enough. Chapter 10: The Price of Rebellion. For all their wealth, these women never escaped the true cost of rebellion: loneliness. Loneliness was the constant companion of runaway brides. It followed them through their new lives. It sat with them at mealtimes. It lay beside them at night. It was more persistent than poverty, more painful than scandal. Because loneliness was not just absence. It was the knowledge of what had been lost: family, community, belonging. These were human needs as fundamental as food and shelter. The runaway brides had sacrificed them in pursuit of freedom. But freedom, they discovered, in siblings, her cousins, her friends. Every siblings, her cousins, her friends. Every familiar face disappeared. She entered a new life with only her husband, a man she often barely knew. If that relationship faltered, she had nothing: no support system, no one to turn to. She was utterly alone. Kitty Van Rensselaer Walsh felt this loneliness acutely. She had been close to her younger sister growing up. They had shared secrets, dreams, and fears. After Kitty fled, her sister was forbidden from contacting her. For 15 years, they had no communication. When they finally reunited by chance on a New York street, both women wept. But the damage was done. They were strangers now. The intimacy they had shared was irretrievable. 15 years was too long. Too much had changed. They exchanged pleasantries and parted. Kitty walked away, feeling more alone than before. The loneliness was compounded by the mundane struggles of daily life. Middle-class women had communities. They attended church socials. They joined sewing circles. They knew their neighbors. But runaway brides often found themselves excluded from these networks. Their scandalous pasts followed them. Even when they moved to new cities, rumors circulated. Neighbors whispered. Shopkeepers gossiped. The runaway bride found herself perpetually on the outside, longing for connection, but unable to achieve it. Children provided some comfort, but also new sources of loneliness. A mother without family support faced pregnancy and childbirth without help. When Kitty gave birth to her first child, she labored alone except for a midwife. No mother to hold her hand, no sister to reassure her. Just pain and fear, and the terrifying responsibility of a new life. After the birth, and there was no one to help, she had to care for the infant herself, exhausted and overwhelmed. She would lie awake at night, the baby crying, and think about the nurseries in her family home, the trained nurses, the night staff, the support that would have been hers. She had chosen differently. This was the consequence. As the runaway brides aged, the loneliness deepened. Their husbands died or left. Their children grew up and moved away. They found themselves elderly and alone. no family to care for them, no community to support them. Some ended their days in poorhouses, surrounded by strangers. They died as they had lived since fleeing, isolated. The emotional scars were profound. Many runaway brides suffered from what we would now recognize as depression and anxiety. They experienced persistent sadness. They lost interest in activities. They felt hopeless about the future. But in the late 1800s, mental health was not understood. These women were told to pray more, to work harder, to stop indulging in self-pity. The suffering had no name. It simply was. Some women coped by keeping detailed journals. They wrote thousands of pages, documenting their thoughts and feelings. These journals are heartbreaking to read. They reveal the depth of the emotional cost. One woman wrote, "I have everything I thought I wanted. A husband who loves me, children, a simple life free from society's demands. So why do I feel empty? Why do I wake each morning with a weight on my chest? I have freedom, but freedom feels like drowning." Others coped through religion. They became intensely devout. They attended church multiple times per week. They found comfort in prayer and scripture. The church provided structure and community when everything else was lost. Some runaway brides became lay missionaries, traveling to poor neighborhoods to help those less fortunate. Serving others gave their suffering meaning. If they had to endure poverty and isolation, at least they could use it to help someone else. A few turned to alcohol or laudanum. These substances dulled the pain temporarily, but they created new problems. Addiction was common among isolated, depressed women. It gave them an escape from unbearable reality. Of course, it also destroyed their health, their relationships, and what little stability they had achieved. Several runaway brides died young from overdoses, accidental or otherwise. The question that haunted them never went away. Was it worth it? In their darkest moments, usually late at night when the loneliness was overwhelming, they faced this question honestly. They had traded everything for autonomy. But what good was autonomy when you had no one to share your life with? What good was freedom when it meant isolation? They had escaped the gilded cage, but they had not escaped suffering. They had simply exchanged one kind of suffering for another. Some concluded it had been worth it. They maintained that dignity and self-determination were worth any price. Even in poverty, even in loneliness, they were living their own lives. They had not been sold. They had not been forced. They had chosen. That choice, however costly, had value. When Margaret Lawrence, the runaway bride who found happiness in rural Vermont, was asked in her old age if she regretted her decision, she said, "Not for a moment. I was poor. I was excluded from society. But I was myself. I cannot imagine anything more valuable than that." But others reached different conclusions. They admitted, quietly and with great pain, that they had made a mistake. The cost had been too high. If they could go back, they would have obeyed their parents. They would have married the approved suitor. At least then, they would have had comfort, security, and family. Instead, they had nothing. They were old and broken and alone. The loneliness had won. Mrs. H., the woman who returned to her family only to be treated as a servant, wrote in a letter discovered after her death, "I destroyed my life for love, but love was not enough. Love could not feed me. Love could not shelter me. Love could not hold me when I was frightened and alone. I wish I had been wiser. I wish I had stayed." The tragedy was that there were no good options. Obedience led to one kind of misery. Rebellion led to another. The problem was not the women's choices. The problem was a society that gave women impossible choices. Marry for duty and be unhappy. Marry for love and be poor and outcast. Either way, suffering was guaranteed. The only question was which suffering you could endure. The psychological cost extended beyond the women themselves. It affected everyone around them. Husbands felt guilty for the hardships their wives endured. Children grew up in homes shadowed by loss and regret. The entire family structure was haunted by the ghost of what might have been. This intergenerational trauma was invisible but real. It shaped the lives of people who never knew the original wealth, never attended the balls, never lived in the mansions. But they felt the absence. They knew, on some level, that something had been sacrificed. Something important had been lost. In the end, the true price of rebellion was not measured in dollars or social standing. It was measured in human connection. The runaway brides lost their families. They lost their communities. They lost their place in the world. Some built new connections. Others never did. But all of them carried the wound. All of them knew what it was to be exiled, to be alone, to be free but lonely. That was the price they paid. That was the cost of escaping the gilded cage. Chapter 11. The Forgotten Heiresses. Time often erases the names of those who dared to defy, but their stories endure in the shadows of history. Most runaway brides disappeared from historical record. They did not write memoirs. They did not sit for interviews. They wanted to be forgotten. The scandal had defined them for so long that anonymity became their greatest wish. They changed their names. They moved to obscure places. They lived quietly. When they died, their obituaries, if they had any, were brief and vague. The story of their rebellion was omitted. They were remembered, if at all, as ordinary women who had lived ordinary lives. The drama of their youth was erased, but some stories survived. They survived in family letters hidden in attics. They survived in newspaper archives. They survived in newspaper archives. They survived in the whispered stories that grandchildren heard from elderly relatives. These fragments allow us to piece together what happened to these women. Most of the stories are sad. A few are triumphant. All are complicated. The irony is that the women who obeyed, who married the men their parents chose, are even more forgotten. Their lives followed predictable patterns. They married. They had children. They performed their social duties. They died. There was nothing remarkable to record. They are listed in genealogies as dates and marriage connections. But their inner lives, their thoughts, their struggles, are completely lost. At least the runaway brides left a mark, however painful. Consider the descendants of these women. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren of runaway brides often discovered family secrets by accident. They might find an old photograph with a name they did not recognize, or they might hear an aunt mention a distant relative who was never discussed. When they asked questions, the answers were vague and uncomfortable. That was a long time ago. We don't talk about that. It's complicated. The silence was thick with shame. Some descendants became amateur historians. Slowly, they reconstructed what had happened. They found newspaper articles. They located legal documents. They interviewed elderly relatives who remembered fragments. Slowly, they reconstructed what had happened. Many were shocked to learn that their respectable great-grandmother had once been a scandalous runaway bride. The knowledge changed how they saw their family history. It revealed that their ancestors were more complex and courageous than they had imagined. Other descendants reacted with anger. They felt that their great-grandmother had selfishly thrown away advantages that could have benefited future generations. If she had just obeyed, if she had married the wealthy man, the family would have inherited a fortune. Instead, they were middle class or poor. They blamed the runaway bride for their circumstances. This blame was unfair, but it was real. The consequences of her choice rippled forward through time, affecting people who never knew her. A few descendants felt pride. They saw their ancestor as a rebel and a pioneer. She had defied society's expectations. She had claimed her own life. She had paid a terrible price, but she had been brave. These descendants honored her memory. They told her story to their children. They ensured that her name would not be forgotten. They transformed the family shame into family pride. The broader legacy of the runaway brides is difficult to assess. Did their rebellions change anything? Now, on one level, no. Society continued to pressure women into arranged marriages for several more decades. Wealthy families continued to trade their daughters for titles and alliances. The system did not collapse because a few women fled. But on another level, the rebellions mattered. They demonstrated that women could resist. They proved that obedience was not inevitable. They planted seeds of doubt in the minds of other young women. If she could run, maybe I can too. This psychological shift was subtle but significant. It contributed to the larger women's rights movement that was gaining momentum in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The runaway brides were not suffragists or activists. Most of them never engaged in political work, but their personal rebellions had political implications. They challenged the fundamental assumption that women should accept whatever men decided for them. They asserted, through their actions, that women were human beings with agency and desires. This assertion was radical for its time. Some historians argue that the runaway brides were selfish. They abandoned their families for personal gratification. They caused pain and scandal for their own desires. This interpretation is not entirely wrong. The runaway brides did cause pain. Their parents genuinely suffered. Their siblings were affected. The families lost wealth and status. These were real consequences, but other historians argue that the parents were the selfish ones. They tried to force their daughters into unwanted marriages for social and financial gain. They prioritized status over their daughters' happiness. They treated their children as commodities. The daughter's rebellion was justified resistance to tyranny. This interpretation is also not entirely wrong. The truth is probably somewhere in between. The runaway brides were neither saints nor sinners. They were complex human beings making difficult choices in impossible circumstances. They deserve neither worship nor condemnation. They deserve understanding. They deserve to be remembered as whole people, not as moral lessons. As the 20th century progressed, society slowly changed. Women gained more rights. They could vote. They could own property. They could pursue careers. Arranged marriages became less common. Young people chose their own partners based on compatibility and love. The gilded cage that had trapped the heiresses of the 1880s gradually opened. The change was slow and uneven, but it happened. Would this change have occurred without the runaway brides? Probably. The women's rights movement had many contributors. The runaway brides were a small part of a much larger story. But they were a part. Their individual rebellions were threads in a larger tapestry of resistance and change. The forgotten heiresses teach us several lessons. First, that wealth does not guarantee happiness. The runaway brides had every material advantage, but they were profoundly unhappy. Their unhappiness was real and valid, even though they lived in luxury. Second, that freedom is costly. The runaway brides gained autonomy but lost almost everything else. Freedom is not free. It requires sacrifice. Third, that societal change is built on individual courage. Every rebellion, no matter how small, matters. Every person who refuses to accept injustice contributes to progress. The runaway brides also remind us that history is made by ordinary people making extraordinary choices. These women were not born rebels. They were raised to be obedient. But circumstances pushed them to the breaking point. They found courage they did not know they possessed. They risked everything for a chance at a different life. Most of them lost, but they tried. And in trying, they became part of history. Their names are mostly forgotten now. Their graves are unmarked or lost. Their stories survive only in fragments, but they lived, they loved, they suffered, they rebelled, they mattered, not because they succeeded, not because they changed the world, but because they dared to try. In an age when most women never dared at all, that was enough. Chapter 12. The ultimate question. Was it worth it? After everything they lost, did they gain anything in the end? Was the price of freedom worth it? This question has no simple answer. It could not have a simple answer, because the question itself is flawed. It assumes that worth can be measured, that you can add up the costs and benefits and determine whether a life choice was justified. But human lives do not work that way. We cannot calculate the value of freedom versus the value of security. We cannot measure love against wealth. The variables are too complex, the outcomes too uncertain. For each individual woman, the answer was different. Margaret Lawrence, the runaway bride who found happiness with her country doctor husband, would have said yes. Absolutely, it was worth it. She lived a life of purpose and contentment. She had few regrets. The poverty was real, but the love was also real. The social exile hurt, but the autonomy healed. For her, the trade was successful. Emily Astor, who died alone and destitute in a charity ward, would have said no. It was not worth it. She traded a life of comfort for a life of suffering. She gained nothing except years of grinding poverty and loneliness. She died young, broken, forgotten. If she could have chosen again, she would have stayed. She would have married the man her parents selected. She would have been unhappy in that marriage, yes, but at least she would have been alive. At least she would have been warm and fed. For her, the trade was catastrophic. And then there were the women in between. Women like Kitty Van Rensselaer Walsh, who lived long lives filled with both joy and hardship. Their stories did not have clear morals. They struggled financially. They were lonely. They were excluded from society, but they also experienced real love. They raised children. They lived authentically. Was it worth it? Kitty probably asked herself this question every day and answered it differently depending on her mood. On days when her children laughed and her husband was kind, yes, it was worth it. On days when she could not afford coal for the fire and her stomach ached with hunger, no, it was not. The philosopher's answer is that the question itself reveals a misunderstanding about human choice. We do not choose our actions by calculating worth. We choose based on what we can endure. The runaway brides could not endure marrying men they did not love. They could not endure living lives dictated entirely by their parents. The pain of that future was so acute and so unbearable that any alternative seemed preferable. They did not flee because they believed the outcome would be better. They fled because staying was impossible. From this perspective, asking if it was worth it misses the point. It was not a rational cost-benefit analysis. It was a survival instinct. When an animal chews off its leg to escape a trap, we do not ask if the leg was worth the freedom. We understand that the animal simply could not remain trapped. In escape, consequences were irrelevant. Yet the question persists because we, looking back, want to learn from their experiences. We want to know if rebellion is worthwhile, if defying societal expectations leads to better outcomes, if choosing love over wealth is wise. We want clear answers. History rarely provides them. Yeah, what we can say is this: the runaway brides expanded the boundaries of what was possible for women. Before them, fleeing your wedding was unthinkable. After them, it was thinkable. Difficult, dangerous, but thinkable. They proved that the social order was not as rigid as it appeared. That individual will could challenge institutional power. That women were not simply objects to be traded between men. This contribution cannot be measured in dollars or comfort. But it mattered. The runaway brides also revealed the limitations of individual rebellion. Escaping one cage did not create true freedom. The larger structures of society remained intact. Patriarchy was not defeated because a few heiresses fled their weddings. Economic inequality continued. Gender discrimination persisted. The runaway bride's personal victories did not translate into systemic change. For that, broader movements were needed. Laws had to change. Culture had to evolve. And individual courage was necessary but not sufficient. Perhaps the most honest answer to the question is, it depends on what you value. If you value security, comfort, and social acceptance above all else, then no, it was not worth it. The runaway brides lost all these things. If you value autonomy, authenticity, and self-determination above all else, then yes, it was worth it. The runaway brides gained these things, however, briefly. The problem is that most people value both. We want security and freedom, comfort and authenticity. The runaway brides were forced to choose. In choosing, they lost half of what makes life bearable. The tragedy of the gilded cage was that it should not have been a choice. Women should not have had to choose between happiness and security, between love and wealth, between autonomy and family. A just society would have allowed them to have both. But the society they lived in was not just. It forced impossible choices. The runaway brides did their best with the options they had. That is all anyone can do. Looking at their stories today, we see both how far we have come and how far we still have to go. Women in modern America have far more freedom than the heiresses of the Gilded Age. We can choose our own partners. We can pursue careers. We can own property. We can vote. The legal and social constraints that bound the runaway brides have loosened significantly. We owe this progress to countless women who fought for rights and freedoms. The runaway brides were a small part of that larger struggle. But constraints still exist. Women still face pressure to prioritize family over career, to marry and have children, even when they do not want to. to meet beauty standards that require time and money, to be nice and accommodating and non-threatening. The gilded cage has evolved, but it has not disappeared. It simply looks different now. Understanding the stories of the runaway brides helps us recognize the cages that still exist, and perhaps helps us find the courage to resist them. The ultimate lesson of the runaway brides is not about whether they made the right choice. It is about the fact that they had to choose at all. A society that forces women into impossible choices is a society that needs to change. The runaway brides could not change society. They could only save themselves. And even that, they barely managed, and most of them paid terrible prices. But they tried. They dared. They refused to accept that their lives were not their own. Was it worth it? The question echoes through history. Each of us must answer it for ourselves, based on our own values, based on what we believe makes a life meaningful, based on whether we think freedom, however costly, is worth pursuing. The runaway brides cannot tell us the answer. They can only show us what happened when they tried. The rest is up to us. In the end, perhaps the most fitting tribute to these women is not to judge their choices, not to declare them right or wrong, but simply to remember them, to acknowledge their courage and their suffering, to understand that they were trapped in an unjust system and did their best to escape. They were not perfect. They made mistakes. They caused pain. But they also lived fully, desperately, authentically. They claimed their own stories, even when the world tried to write different endings for them. That claim, that refusal to be entirely controlled, is worth something. Maybe not everything they lost, but something. And in a world that tried to reduce them to commodities and transactions, claiming anything at all was an act of profound resistance. The gilded cage still exists in various forms. It always will, as long as power, imbalances, and social expectations constrain human freedom. But the runaway brides showed us that the cage can be escaped. The locks can be picked. The bars can be bent. It will cost you. It will cost you dearly. But it can be done. Whether it should be done, whether the price is worth paying, that is a question each person must answer alone, in the quiet moments when they confront who they are and who they want to be. The runaway brides made their choice. Now we must make ours.